They said I was drugged, but the land kept receipts, quiet and locked away. Rural back roads, a fenced off property, and one night folks swore I couldn't remember. The gas station bell rang before I even touched the door, like it knew I was coming, like it had already heard. Before we go any further, real quick, if stories like this hit home for you, tap like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what city you're listening from tonight. Now, let me tell you what they said about me. It started the way things always do in small towns, quiet, casual, like nothing important was happening at all. I stopped at Miller's Gas just after sunrise, sky still pale, air still holding on to night. The kind of morning where the world hasn't decided what it's gonna be yet. My tires crunched gravel loud enough to feel like an announcement, and I remember thinking I should have waited another 10 minutes, should have let the place wake up without me. Inside, the floor smelled like old coffee and motor oil, same as always. The cooler hummed low and steady, like a breath held too long. Two men stood by the counter, talking soft, not whispering, not until I walked in. They didn't stop talking, just slowed down. I grabbed a bottle of water, cold enough to sting my palm, and felt eyes on me without anyone looking straight at my face. That's how you know something's wrong. Folks don't stare, they glance, then glance again, like they're checking if the rumor matches the person. The clerk didn't say my name when I set the bottle down. He always said my name. He just rang it up and said, "Morning," like he wasn't sure it still applied to me. That's when I heard it. Not words exactly, more like a shape. She was out there. Real late. Didn't look right. The sentences didn't finish themselves. They didn't have to. Around here, people fill in the blanks quick, faster than they fill up their trucks. I paid, took my change, coins heavier than usual, like they'd soaked something up. When I turned to leave, one of the men finally looked at me, right at me, then slid his eyes away like he'd touched something hot. Outside, the sun was climbing slow, dragging light across the pumps. I stood there longer than I meant to, the morning suddenly thicker, heavier. By the time I got back in my car, I already knew something had been decided, and nobody bothered to invite me to the conversation. They said I'd been found wandering. That's the word they liked, wandering, like I was a dog that slipped the fence, like I didn't have a direction or a reason or a mind of my own. They said I was eyes glassy, that I looked confused, that I didn't know where I was. Funny thing is, no one ever asked me, not once. No, what do you remember? No, are you okay? No, did something happen out there? Just nods and lowered voices and that look people get when they think they're being kind by not digging deeper. The story moved faster than I did, ahead of me, into the diner, into church, into the post office. By noon, it had grown legs. By evening, it had details. Someone said I'd been drugged. Someone else said I probably mixed things I shouldn't have. Another voice, soft but sharp, said maybe I was lucky nothing worse happened. That one stuck because nobody explained what worse meant. They just let it sit there between us. I tried to replay that night in my head, not like a movie, more like fragments, a smell, a sound, the way cold feels when it hits skin that's already tired. I remembered the fence, old wire bent in places, warning signs bleached almost white, private property, the letters barely holding on. I remembered standing near it, close enough to see where the metal had been pressed down like something heavy leaned there often. But when I mentioned that, people shifted. "You don't need to worry about all that," they said. "It was probably nothing." Best not to go poking around. Best for who? At the grocery store, a woman I'd known since I was a kid touched my arm gentle and careful, like I might break. "Honey," she said, "you don't gotta be embarrassed." Embarrassed landed wrong. I wasn't embarrassed. I was angry and tired and starting to feel like I was disappearing. Every time someone told the story, my name got quieter, the facts got louder. They spoke about me like I wasn't standing right there, like I was already a memory, a lesson, a cautionary tale. At night, I lay awake listening to the house settle, wood popping, pipes ticking, the floor creaking like it remembered where I stepped before I did. I stared at the ceiling and counted what I knew for sure. I knew I wasn't drunk. I knew I wasn't lost. I knew fear doesn't feel like confusion. Fear feels sharp, focused, alert. But nobody wanted that version. Easy answers travel better, especially ugly ones, especially the kind that let everyone else off the hook. If I was drugged, no one had to ask who was out there. If I was confused, the land didn't matter. If I couldn't remember, they didn't have to listen. I passed the fence again 2 days later, didn't stop, just slowed down. The weeds were bent like they'd been walked through recently, tire tracks still visible even after rain tried to smooth them out. I felt something then, not panic, not dread, recognition, like the ground was holding its breath. Back in town, the whispers settled into something steadier, a shared understanding, a version everyone agreed to carry. I heard my name spoken like punctuation, like the end of a sentence. She was drugged. Period. I wanted to scream, but instead I stayed quiet because I realized something sitting in my car outside the post office, hands on the wheel, engine off. They weren't telling the story to help me. They were telling it to protect something else, something fenced, something private, something they didn't want named. That night I wrote everything down, not the rumors or guesses, just what my body remembered, the cold, the insects cutting through the dark, the way my heart never slowed. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the page felt heavier than it should. When I finished, I sat in the quiet and listened to the house breathe around me. The town thought the story was done, but I was still here, still remembering, still standing on my own name, and I couldn't shake the question that followed me into sleep. How could they be so sure about a night they weren't there for? The gate didn't creak when I touched it, and that's what I remember first. I expected noise, a warning, something to stop me, but it stayed quiet. The sign was still there, hanging crooked on one bolt, white once with letters that had long ago given up. Private property. It felt less like a rule and more like a suggestion someone hoped you'd follow. I'd driven past that land my whole life. School bus mornings, late night rides with the windows down, knowing every dip in the road around it. But I'd never gone in. Nobody did. Not because anyone said not to, but because you don't step where no one else steps. That's how small towns teach you without ever saying the words. That night, I didn't come looking for trouble or answers. I came chasing quiet, the kind you can't find once people start telling your story for you. The air was cool but settled, clinging to my skin. Crickets buzzed loud enough to feel like static. I killed the engine early and walked the rest, every step sounding louder than it should have. The gate opened easy, too easy, like it had been moved not long before. The metal was warm under my hand even though the sun had been gone for hours, and I told myself not to overthink it. The ground on the other side wasn't soft like I expected. It was packed down hard, almost smooth in places, like something heavy had gone back and forth again and again. I stood there letting my eyes adjust, breathing slow. The land stretched wider than it ever looked from the road. Trees spaced out, not wild, but cared for, managed. That's when I noticed the tracks cutting through the dirt at an angle. Not fresh, but recent, too clean to be old. Wide tires, the kind that don't belong to farm equipment. Nobody in town had mentioned those. I followed the tracks without thinking, just far enough to see them curve toward the trees. The dirt there was darker, damp, pressed deeper, and when I stepped closer, my foot sank just a little. That tight feeling behind my ribs showed up then, the one that tells you to pay attention. I wasn't scared, but I wasn't calm either. My body felt alert, like it remembered something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. The quiet out there was different. No wind, no road noise, just insects and my own breathing, even the crickets sounding careful. I crouched and touched the dirt, cool and firm, almost polished where the tires had passed. Grit stuck to my fingers, and I knew this wasn't wandering and it wasn't confusion. This was a place people used and then pretended not to see. Something caught the moonlight farther back, just a flicker, and I walked toward it slow, every step measured. It was a scrap of clear plastic, torn, maybe part of a bag, maybe not, and I didn't pick it up. Some things feel like evidence the moment you see them, like they don't belong to you even when they're right at your feet. I backed away without rushing and paused at the fence again. The wire dipped where someone had leaned hard enough to bend it, lining up with the tracks like punctuation at the end of a sentence. I rested my hand on the post and felt a vibration, maybe a distant engine, maybe just my pulse in my ears. On the drive home, my headlights stayed low and the road felt longer than usual, every mailbox passing like a witness. Inside the house, I turned on just the sink lamp, yellow and soft, making the rooms feel smaller and safer. I washed my hands twice, watching the dirt spiral down the drain, feeling a strange sense of loss, like something important had slipped away. Lying in bed, listening to the ceiling fan tick with one blade slightly off balance, I thought about how nobody ever talked about that land unless they were warning you away from it. Nobody talked about who owned it or what it was used for. Private property meant more than ownership. It meant control and silence. In the days after, I paid attention. Folks joked too hard about trespassers, mentioned the fence needing fixing without saying why. When I drove past again, a new chain hung there, shiny and fresh, like an afterthought that settled something in me. You don't lock doors unless there's something inside worth keeping, or something you're afraid might get out. That night didn't give me answers, but it gave me weight, gave shape to the feeling that I wasn't the problem they said I was. I wasn't wandering and I wasn't lost. I had crossed a line that wasn't meant to be crossed, and the town decided the easiest way to explain that was to explain me away. As I lay there, listening to the house breathe, one thought stayed with me, steady and uncomfortable. If this place needed so much silence, what was it really hiding from all of us? There are hours in that night I can't place on a clock. They float loose, like fog that never quite burned off, but they weren't empty, no matter how badly people wanted them to be. Folks kept saying I didn't remember anything, like my mind went dark, like someone flipped a switch and left me standing there blinking. They said it with certainty, like they'd been inside my head, like they knew what forgetting looked like better than I did. The truth sat quieter than that. I remembered the smell of pine first, sharp and clean, almost sweet, the kind that hits the back of your throat when the air's cool. That smell doesn't wander in by accident. I remembered the hum next, low and steady, mechanical, not loud enough to demand attention, but constant, like something working in the background, keeping time. A generator, maybe. I didn't know where it was, only that it was there. Fear came back to me the same way, not all at once, not dramatic, just a tight feeling in my chest with edges. Fear that sharp doesn't come from being out of it. It comes from knowing exactly where you are. That's what bothered me most about the way people talked, how they used the word drugged like it explained everything, like it tied things up neat enough to stop questions before they started. Drugged meant helpless. Drugged meant unreliable. Drugged meant nobody had to ask what I saw. It was a lazy word, a soft cover pulled over something heavy, the kind of explanation that lets people sleep at night. I tried once to say fear doesn't work like that confusion isn't the same as absence, but the person I was talking to just nodded, smiled, and changed the subject, like clarity was something to be avoided. At home, I pulled out an old notebook with a bent cover and dog-eared pages that smelled faintly of dust and ink. I started writing without thinking about how it sounded. Not full sentences, just pieces. Pine, cold dirt, metal humming, breath too loud in my ears. I wrote until my hand slowed and the words spaced themselves out, each line feeling like a marker driven into ground that could still be mapped. Sometimes I stopped and just sat there, pen hovering, listening to the house, waiting to see if anything else surfaced. Memory doesn't come back like a movie. It comes back like weather, a pressure shift, a sudden chill, a smell that doesn't belong in the room you're in. I remembered the weight of my shoes, how the dirt clung to them, how I stood still longer than felt natural, not because I was lost, but because I was listening. That detail mattered. Listening implies choice, and nobody liked that part. The town's version needed me blank, needed me empty enough for them to write over. The more I wrote, the less sense the drug story made. If I'd been drugged, why did my body remember tension instead of softness? Why did my jaw ache like I'd been holding it tight? Why did my hands remember dirt under my nails? Drugs blur, but fear sharpens. I remembered kneeling for a moment, the ground cold through my jeans, remembering thinking I shouldn't stay there too long. That thought didn't belong to someone drifting. It belonged to someone deciding. I flipped back through the notebook one night and noticed how specific the missing pieces were, cleanly cut out, like someone trimmed around them on purpose. I couldn't tell you how long I stood near the fence, but I could tell you how the air changed when I stepped closer. I couldn't tell you what time it was, but I could tell you the generator never stopped. That wasn't unconsciousness, that was selective silence. I pressed my palm flat on the page and felt the indent of the pen through the paper. Proof I'd been here, proof I'd thought these things through. One afternoon, I sat on the porch with the notebook open on my lap, cicadas loud in the trees, sunlight catching the edges of the pages. A neighbor waved, and I waved back, wondering how many people knew the story wasn't quite right and chose not to touch it anyway. It's easier to believe someone else lost time than to believe time was taken. I traced the lines I'd written with my finger, each one steadier than the last, like laying boards across a gap. What if forgetting wasn't the same as being unconscious? What if my mind did exactly what it was supposed to do and kept what mattered while dropping what would have broken me? The idea wasn't comfortable, but it felt true. Late that night, I added one more line to the notebook. I was scared because I understood something. I didn't know what that something was yet, only that it lived in the spaces everyone else kept glossing over, in the hours they said didn't count. I slid the notebook under my bed, not hiding it, just keeping it close, like a spare key. And as I lay there listening to the house settle, the missing hours didn't feel missing anymore. They felt guarded. And for the first time since the whispers started, I trusted myself enough to wonder what they were so afraid I'd remember next. The morning came in thin and pale, light without warmth, and I felt eyes on me before I saw him. He was parked across the road, half on the shoulder, half in the grass, like he hadn't decided whether to stay or go. His truck was old and boxy, red once maybe, now coated in dust the same color as the land behind the fence, the kind that stains instead of settles. He didn't wave or pretend to be busy, he just sat there with both hands on the wheel, watching my house like it might blink first. I took a sip of my coffee, burned and bitter, and when I walked toward my car, his door opened slow, like his knees argued with him. He was tall but slouched, a man who'd learned to fold inward over time, and he didn't smile or frown, just studied me the way folks study storms rolling in. "Morning," I said, my voice sounding normal even though I expected it not to. He nodded once, his eyes moving from my hands to my shoes to my face like he was taking inventory. "You all right?" he asked, and it didn't sound like concern, more like confirmation. I told him I was fine, and he made a low sound in his throat that wasn't agreement. His gaze slid past me down the road toward the trees, toward the land everyone pretended not to see, and that's when I noticed the tires on his truck, wide, worn, still holding red dirt in the grooves, the same dirt I'd felt under my fingers. "You were out late," he said, not a question, and I let the space stretch before telling him he was too. His jaw tightened just a flicker, but it was enough. He shifted his weight, looked at the ground, then back at me, his eyes tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. "You don't need to be going around that property," he said, and I tilted my head and told him I hadn't said anything about the property. He exhaled slow through his nose, like he was counting something down, and said, "People talk," which almost made me laugh. "Nobody talked about you," I said, and his focus sharpened, not angry, just alert. He told me the best thing I could do was let it go, for my own good, the words landing gentle enough to feel heavy. I asked why, and he looked back toward the road and said some places don't need remembering. I asked him if he was scared of me, and he let out a short, humorless chuckle, saying no, he was scared for me. That's when I felt it. Not fear, but recognition. He wasn't warning me because I was wrong, he was warning me because I was close. I told him I hadn't wandered and I hadn't been confused, and he flinched just enough to notice. "It doesn't matter," he said quickly. "That's what folks are saying." I told him that was what he was saying, and silence filled the space between us. He rubbed his hand along the side of his truck, leaving a clean streak through the dust like he wanted to erase something he couldn't reach. "You remember things," he said finally, and when I told him some, his eyes dropped and he nodded to himself like that was the problem. He stepped back toward his truck and said I didn't want to be right about this, that I should trust him. I watched his shoulders, tight and lifted like he expected a blow, and told him he'd been there. He froze, didn't turn around, didn't deny it, and after a moment said he'd been nearby, like that word could create distance. "Whatever I thought I saw," he said, "whatever I felt, sometimes it's better to leave it alone," and when I asked for who, he closed his eyes just a second before saying, "For everyone," his voice not believing it. He got in his truck and drove off, dust lifting behind him and hanging in the air longer than it should have, and I stood there until it settled. All day his words followed me, "Let it go for your own good," and I replayed the way fear crept into his face sideways when I mentioned the land. That wasn't fear of exposure, it was fear of something waking up. That evening I drove past the fence again, saw the new chain glinting in the low sun, fresh and heavy, and thought about his truck, the dust, the tires, and how he knew exactly what I meant without me saying it. He wasn't guarding the land, he was guarding a story, one that depended on me being quiet, confused, ashamed. That night I opened my notebook and wrote a single line, underlining it twice. He wasn't mad, he was afraid. As the house settled around me and the quiet deepened, one thought stayed sharp enough to keep me awake. If even the ones watching the fence were scared, what exactly were they standing between us of?
Dusk didn't arrive all at once that evening. It seeped in slow, like a thought I didn't want finishing itself. I waited for that hour on purpose, the one where the sky isn't bright enough to notice you, but not dark enough to hide everything either. The cicadas were already loud, buzzing uneven, like they were clearing their throats, a sound that covers footsteps, breathing, and second thoughts. I parked farther down the road this time and walked in empty-handed. No phone light, no plan, just a quiet agreement with myself to leave if it felt wrong. The gate was locked now, a new chain hanging heavy in silver, clean enough to catch the last of the light. Someone had come back, cared enough to tighten things up, and I didn't touch it. Instead, I followed the fence line, boots brushing weeds, wire humming faint when I leaned too close. The ground dipped again at the same spot as before, like the land had a soft place it couldn't protect, and I slipped through there easy. The cicadas got louder the farther in I went, the air thick and warm against my skin, sweat gathering slow at the back of my neck. I smelled it before I saw it, dirt, oil, something old and damp underneath, and then the shed came into view where the trees thinned. It was low and squat, metal sides streaked with rust like it had been crying for years, one door hanging crooked, not fully closed. I stopped a few feet short and listened, heart steady but alert, cicadas and wind the only things answering back. The ground around the shed was wrong, not just disturbed, but worked, torn up in uneven patches, like someone moved fast and didn't care how it looked after. Footprints overlapped, heels dug deep, dirt packed hard in some places and loose in others, the kind of mess that comes from being rushed. Accidents leave patterns, and this didn't have one. Something had been dragged there, not far, just enough to leave a smear that hadn't faded, leading into the shadow under the shed. That's where I saw the glove, half buried, fingers curled inward like it had been dropped in a hurry. It was leather, once brown, now stiff with dried mud, the wrist strap frayed and open, a work glove that didn't belong to a story about nothing. I didn't pick it up. Some things don't want to be held, they want to be witnessed. I stayed still for a long time after that, letting the cicadas keep talking, letting the air settle heavy around me, the space near the shed feeling like it remembered pressure, sound, weight. This place didn't whisper accident, didn't even murmur it. It said effort, cleanup, urgency. I backed away slow, careful not to disturb anything else, freezing when my heel caught a rock and my heart jumped hard once. The cicadas didn't stop or even pause, like nothing I could do there would surprise them, and that thought settled deep. The air smelled different once I moved away from the shed, still heavy but calmer, like I'd crossed an invisible line. At the fence, I stopped and looked back once, the shed already melting into shadow, easy to miss if you didn't know where to look. That's how places like this survive. On the drive home, my hands stayed tight on the wheel, the hum of the engine too close to that generator sound I couldn't forget, following me low and steady. I sat on my porch when I got home instead of going inside, dusk fully turned to night, cicadas joined by frogs down by the ditch, normal sounds trying to do their job. I tried to picture someone explaining that ground away, telling a story that made the glove disappear, smoothed out the dirt, turned urgency into coincidence, and I knew it would take work and agreement to pull that off. The ground doesn't lie, but it doesn't argue either. It just waits. I wrote 3 words in my notebook under the porch light: shed, glove, rushed, and closed it. As the night deepened, one thing became clear in the quiet. If the ground remembered this much, then whatever happened here needed explaining away for a reason, and the story they'd told about me was never meant to hold up to it.
The building smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner, like someone tried to make age smell polite. Town Hall sat low and square at the edge of the square, bricks darkened by time and weather, a place I'd been inside plenty growing up for school stuff and sign-ups, always smaller inside than it looked outside. That morning, it felt tighter. When I pushed the door open, the echo followed me in, fluorescent lights humming overhead, a stiff flag in the corner, the clock on the wall ticking loud enough to feel rude. There were 2 desks and 3 people, and nobody looked at me right away. I stood there with my notebook tucked under my arm, heart steady but alert, the kind of calm that comes when you've already been talked about and decided you don't owe anyone politeness. When a woman finally asked if she could help me, her smile didn't reach her eyes. I told her I had questions, and just like that, papers shifted, someone cleared their throat, and the man at the far desk leaned back like he needed distance. I told them I wanted to see the report, the kind that gets written down, and the word landed heavy in the room. The woman slid a thin blue folder across the desk like she was offering me a menu, saying it was everything they had. Inside were 2 pages, black ink and wide margins, the words rushed and smoothed over, found disoriented, possible intoxication, no further action necessary. I read it twice, then again, and asked who wrote it. The man said it was standard procedure, which wasn't an answer. I asked about witnesses, about statements, about why informal notes were enough to decide what happened. The pauses between their answers stretched longer, heavier, until the man finally told me I should be grateful. Grateful for what? I asked. And after a beat too long, he said that nothing worse happened. That word sat there between us, unfinished and thick, and nobody explained what worse meant. When I asked what worse looked like, the room went quiet except for the clock.
I pointed out that the report didn't mention the land, and the man corrected me, saying I'd been found near it, not on it, like that distinction mattered. I asked about the tire tracks, and the woman answered too quickly that she didn't know what I was talking about. I closed the folder and said it felt thin, like something had been decided before it was written, and the man's voice sharpened just enough to tell me I was close to something he didn't like. They said they were trying to help me, said sometimes it's better not to dig for my peace, and I almost laughed at that. Peace doesn't come from silence, it comes from truth having somewhere to land. When the man said the matter was closed, I thought about the glove, the torn ground, the new chain on the gate, and how closed sounded more like a choice than a fact. Outside, the air felt wider, like my lungs finally had room again, the square moving along like nothing was wrong. I sat in my car with the engine off, listening to passing trucks and distant laughter, and wrote one sentence in my notebook: silence is doing a lot of work. On the drive home, I passed the land again without slowing, already knowing the report wasn't meant to explain what happened to me, only to end the conversation. That night, lying in bed, I kept thinking about that word worse, how nobody wanted to define it, how it didn't belong to me at all. It belonged to that land, to the people guarding it, to the story they rushed to write before I could finish remembering. And the question that stayed with me wasn't what happened anymore, it was who needed me not to know.
I didn't raise my voice or sharpen my words, didn't bring proof the way people expect when they think a fight is coming. I just stopped apologizing for existing inside their version of things. It started in quiet places, the accidental conversations at the diner, by the mailbox, outside church while folks waited for the parking lot to clear. And I let them talk first, because they always do. "She's doing better," someone said near me, not to me. "Real scary night," another voice added. "She don't remember much," a third chimed in, helpful as ever. I stirred my coffee slow, watched the cream settle, then looked up and said I remembered enough. That was all it took for the table to pause, like a record skipping before it decides whether to keep playing. Enough changes things. Someone laughed too quickly and said it all worked out, and I let the lie sit there before asking if it really had. I didn't argue about being drugged or try to prove I wasn't confused. I learned that defending yourself keeps you trapped inside someone else's frame, so I stepped out of it instead. I mentioned the fence by the private land like it was nothing, casual as talking about the weather, and I felt the room shift. Spoons clinked too hard, chairs scraped, eyes moved. When someone asked why I'd be there, I said something pulled, and they didn't like that answer. I kept going, saying there were tire tracks, wide and fresh, and when someone suggested they were probably old, I said maybe, but the glove wasn't. That cracked something. Not all the way, just enough. Faces changed, throats cleared, denial worked overtime, and when I said it was a work glove near the shed, the silence turned real. The kind that presses on your ears. I didn't name names, didn't need to. The truth doesn't require full sentences to land. After that, conversations changed shape. People stopped telling the story around me and started asking questions they didn't finish, wondering out loud if something else happened or if I was sure about what I saw. I let them talk, then asked why the report left out the land. And I could feel that question moving through town, from porch to porch, from phone to phone. At the gas station, the bell rang like always, but nobody slowed their voices this time. They just stopped. The clerk met my eyes and said I'd been stirring things up, and I told him things were already stirred, I just wasn't pretending otherwise. Outside, the red dust truck idled at the pump, the same man pretending not to see me until I leaned against my car and waited. When he finally spoke, he warned me I didn't know what I was messing with, and I told him I knew what I saw and what I didn't. He said people would turn on me, and I said they already had, and it hadn't stopped me. Lies need agreement to survive, and once someone stops nodding, even quietly,
the whole thing starts to wobble. By the end of the week, the story had versions again, messy ones. People saying maybe I wasn't drugged, maybe it was more complicated, maybe there was an incident out there after all. Questions spread faster than certainty ever had. I never raised my voice or cornered anyone. I just kept telling the same calm truth over and over, letting it be boring and heavy, letting silence do some of the work. Even the pastor mentioned misunderstandings without looking at me, and afterward a woman squeezed my hand too tight and whispered that I was brave, though I didn't feel brave at all, just done. Done shrinking to fit a story that couldn't hold the truth, done carrying something that never belonged to me. One evening, I drove past the fence again and slowed just enough to see the chains still there and new footprints in the dirt nearby, uneven and fresh. People were looking now. Not everyone, but enough, and that's all it takes. When a town realizes it chose the wrong version, it can't go back to pretending nothing happened, so it hesitates and cracks. At home, I sat on the porch listening to the night settle, crickets and wind, and an engine humming somewhere far off before cutting out. I wrote one line in my notebook, "The lie is tired," and closed it, watching the dark fill in the spaces between trees. The story they'd been telling was wobbling now, never strong to begin with, and as the quiet wrapped around me, one question stayed sharp enough to keep me awake. When a town realizes it chose the wrong version, what is it willing to do to avoid choosing again?
Nothing dramatic followed after that. No sirens cut through the night, no emergency meetings, no one knocking on my door with apologies they'd rehearsed in the mirror. Things didn't explode or unravel all at once. They just settled, like dust after a truck passes, changing the air without announcing itself. Breathing got easier. Sounds felt clearer. The town stopped bracing for something it didn't want to face. People stopped saying I was drugged. They didn't come out and say I wasn't either. They just stopped saying it at all. That's how small towns apologize, by letting a lie starve instead of dragging it into the open. At the diner, voices didn't drop when I walked in anymore. No one rushed to explain things. Conversations moved around me instead of over me, and someone asked how I was sleeping like it was the most normal question in the world. The report stayed the same, thin and untouched. The gate stayed locked, the land stayed quiet, and somehow that told me more than any confession ever could. I drove past the property one last time at sunset, not to investigate or prove anything, just to look. The fence caught the light in places, wire glowing dull gold, the chain hanging heavy and unmoved. The shed sat back where it always had, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Nothing had changed, and everything had. The truth didn't need to be dragged out into daylight. It didn't need witnesses or headlines or someone breaking down and admitting everything. It stayed right where it was. That land had been holding it long before I ever crossed the line, long before people decided it was easier to explain me than explain what really happened out there. Standing there with the engine idling low, I realized they weren't afraid of what I remembered. They were afraid of what never forgot. The ground didn't soften or blur itself. It didn't get confused or tired. It remembered weight and pressure and urgency, remembered effort, and it didn't care how inconvenient that was for anyone else. Life slid back into something close to normal after that, the kind of normal that knows better now. People walked slower past certain places. They didn't ask questions out loud, but they stopped pretending there weren't any. Folks still avoided the topic, but they didn't avoid me, and that mattered more than words ever could. One afternoon, I ran into the man with the red dust truck at the feed store. He looked smaller somehow, worn down around the edges. He nodded once, no warning, no advice, just acknowledgement. We didn't speak, and we didn't need to. Silence can mean surrender, too. At night, I slept better, not because everything made sense, but because I trusted myself again. I trusted the way my body reacted, the way my memory protected what it needed to. I stopped trying to fill in the missing hours. They weren't missing anymore. They were held, kept safe in a way I finally understood. Some truths don't chase you down. They don't bang on doors or shout over crowds or beg to be believed. They wait, patient and unmoving. They wait in dirt, in rusted metal, in places people don't like to name, waiting for someone quiet enough to hear them. I thought about how hard they worked to keep me away from that land. The chains, the warnings, the rushed report, the easy story they all agreed to carry. All that effort for something they claimed was nothing. That's how I knew. If the truth never left that property, then the fear was never about me remembering it. It was about me returning. That night, I wrote one last line in my notebook and closed it for good. The truth stayed. I did too. And for the first time since the whispers started, the quiet didn't feel empty or fragile. It felt earned. If you feel comfortable, I'd appreciate it if you left a like on this video. It helps these quiet stories reach the people who might need them most. You can subscribe to the channel if you'd like to hear more stories like this. Stories about love, endurance, and the things we carry longer than we should. And if you want to, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read them, truly. Knowing this story traveled farther than my living room gives me more comfort than you might imagine. Thank you for sitting with me. Take care of yourself, and take care of the people you love.